Hello. Thank you all for joining us today over Zoom. My name is Ben Lee, and I am a PhD student in the Paul G. Allen School for Computer Science and Engineering here at the University of Washington. And I'm also the Richard and Ina Wilner Memorial Fellow in Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the Strom Center, I'd like to say welcome. Before beginning this introduction, I would just like to state that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. I am pleased to welcome you to this lecture with my colleague, Daniel Schwartz. This talk was originally scheduled for last April, and we are glad to be able to offer it this spring, although we wish it could be in person. Many thanks to the co-sponsors of this lecture, including the Department of History and the African Studies Program at the Jackson School of International Studies. Today's talk would also not be possible without a group of professionals at the Strom Center who work every day to bring quality, thought-provoking, and academic programming to new audiences. They include Sarah Zades-Rosen, Emily Thompson, Kara Schoonmaker, Lauren Kurland, and Rosa Lasley. I'd like to invite you to a special Sephardic Studies event on May 5th, a conversation with Dina Danon and Devin Nar. And in order to keep the focus on today's presentation, attendees in the Zoom webinar do not have video and microphone enabled. Having said that, I please welcome you to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can begin submitting questions at any time, and Noam Pianco will be leading the Q&A and monitoring this function within Zoom over the course of the lecture. Professor Schwartz will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and after that, we'll have a QA session. Just as a brief biography, Daniel Schwartz is a professor of history and chair of the history department at George Washington University. His first book, The First Modern Jew, Spinoza and the History of an Image, was co-winner of the Salo W Prize for the best first book in Jewish studies and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award in History. He is here presenting his second book, Ghetto, the History of a Word, published by Harvard University Press. And as a personal note, I had the chance to get to know Professor Schwartz while we were both fellows at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum during the 2017 to 2018 academic year. I have to thank him personally for a number of conversations that were quite formative in my own pursuit of Jewish studies and Holocaust studies. And moreover, also, while we were at the museum, I was able to follow along as he developed what became chapter 4 of this book. And I can say from personal experience, his fellows talk at the museum stands out in my mind as one of the best talks I've been to. And so I'm particularly looking forward to this presentation. And with that, on behalf of the Strom Center, I'd like to say welcome.
Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you to the Strom Center for inviting me. I know this was originally supposed to be in January of 2020, and then there was a snowstorm that was rumored but failed to materialize. We canceled, and then it was scheduled for April, but then COVID, of course, arrived. So I'm glad, the third time is a charm. I want to start by bringing you back to the summer of 2019. And you may recall a controversy that arose after Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, the fiery left-wing, then freshman Democrat from New York, called the then thankfully Trump administration's immigration detention sites concentration camps. In an argument that went on for weeks and ultimately spurred new protest movements against ICE and the administration's immigration policy, politicians from both sides of the aisle, op-ed columnists, Jewish organizations, cable news journalists, academics, and of course the Twitterati on the right and the left clashed over whether the term concentration camp was appropriate or misplaced. Those who objected blasted the designation for promoting a fallacious analogy between the Holocaust and the administration's treatment of immigrants, and in so doing diminishing the tragedy of the 6 million. Those who defended the label contended, first of all, that concentration camps were not a Nazi invention, and that even the Nazi concentration camps were different from death camps such as Sobibor and Treblinka. Moreover, they argued that for slogans like "never again" to mean anything, mobilizing Holocaust memory to resist all forms of dehumanization was necessary and legitimate. But for much of the summer of 2019, debate raged not only over the morality of the detention centers, but over how they should be named. This concentration camp controversy was a salient reminder that language is frequently a battlefield. We tend to think that we have minimized the scope of disagreement when we boil a debate down to semantics. It's just semantics, we are wont to say. The reality is that so many of our cultural arguments manifest as arguments over words, over what they mean, how they are used, and who gets to define them. Once you label something, you change how people perceive it. Indeed, the phrase one man's terrorist is another's freedom fighter, however cliche, highlights the degree to which names matter. The phenomenon being described may be the same, but how it is termed can make all the difference. The 500-year history of the word ghetto is similarly fraught. Up until roughly the mid-19th century, ghetto meant simply a legally compulsory, segregated, and enclosed Jewish quarter of an Italian town or city. Since then, the applications and associations of the term have multiplied. The ghetto has been identified with everything from miniature bastions of traditional Judaism to immigrant enclaves in the big city. It has been used to refer to pre-genocidal sites of the Nazi Holocaust, as well as to inner city neighborhoods populated by Black and brown people. A noun with a long history of being used as an adjective, from the ghetto Jew to the ubiquitous today, that's so ghetto, a term that, depending on how it is used and who is using it, can suggest both danger and security, weakness and toughness, social pathology and communal solidarity, a prison and a fortress, a sociological concept that is anything but value-free, a keyword of both the Jewish and African-American experiences. The ghetto, historically, has been all of the above. In its very ubiquity and elusiveness, it exemplifies Nietzsche's claim and on the genealogy of morals that, quote, only that which has no history is definable. The history of ghettos is, to a substantial degree, a history of struggle and argument over the meaning, usage, and application of the label ghetto itself. So in the rest of my remarks this afternoon, I want to highlight a few key shifts in the history of the ghetto as word and concept. First, I'll trace the origins of the ghetto, explaining how it evolved from a Venetian place name with no Jewish associations to a generic Jewish space found throughout early modern Italy. Next, I'll discuss the resurrection of the term ghetto to designate new Jewish spaces, from voluntary immigrant neighborhoods like New York's Lower East Side to the holding pens of Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe that were as dissimilar from the pre-emancipation Italian ghettos as they were from each other. Finally, I'll address the transference of the ghetto idea and label from Jews to Blacks, before closing with a reflection on whether, amid all these ruptures, we can speak of a single continuous history of ghettos. So our story begins in Venice. In 1509, an alliance of armies, led by France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Papal States, attacked Venice and overran its mainland territories. Many refugees from these areas fled to Venice, and Jews, who had only briefly in the late 14th century been permitted to establish an open Jewish community in Venice proper, were among them. The question emerged of what was to be done with these Jews. Some were of the view that there was economic advantage to be had in permitting the Jews to stay and serve as moneylenders in the city itself. Others, especially friars and preachers, strenuously opposed any relaxation of the government's policy against allowing Jews to reside in Venice, objecting in particular to their presence all over the city. Out of this debate came a compromise solution proposed by a Venetian senator, arguing that it was bad that Jews were residing in Venice wherever they chose. He proposed, quote, to send all of them to live in the Ghetto Nuovo, or the new ghetto, which is like a castle, and to make drawbridges and close it with a wall. The Duke of Venice and the Senate gave their support to this proposal. And on March 29, 1516, an edict was passed ordering all Jews then living throughout the city, as well as all those yet to come, to go immediately to live in the Ghetto Nuovo. Christian inhabitants of this area were compelled to vacate their homes. All outward-facing doors and windows on the island were to be bricked over, and gates were to be erected in 2 places, to be opened at sunrise and locked at sunset. In imposing residential segregation on its Jews, Venice had precedent it could draw on, though it does not appear that they did so knowingly. The idea of a voluntary Jewish street or Jewish quarter was as old as the diaspora itself, and the idea of a wall with gates was hardly a novelty in a pre-modern world where cities were typically fortified. We know of at least one Jewish community in the 11th century Rhineland that was housed in a neighborhood with gates and walls, though this seems to have been a measure for their security meant to induce them to settle. Even if we stress the element of force and exclusivity in the idea of the ghetto, here too there was precedent. Starting in the 13th century, there were church councils that intermittently called for the complete segregation of Jews from Christians, though until the 15th century, these were rarely heeded by secular rulers. In the final decades of Jewish life in Christian Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella pressed for the creation of mandatory and homogeneous Jewish quarters, or juderias, though they ended up expelling the Jews in 1492 before the policy was fully implemented. Most of these early efforts to isolate Jews proved abortive. However, Frankfurt am Main's compulsory and exclusive Judengasse, or Jewish street, preceded Venice's ghetto by some 54 years, yet lasted just as long. If it is somewhat problematic to view the Venetians as originators of the idea of the ghetto, a stronger case can be made for their title to the term itself, though even this must be qualified. The Venetians did not coin the word ghetto, at least in its sense of an enclosed Jewish quarter. Most historians believe that this meaning has its roots in geographic happenstance, the fact that the island to which Jews were restricted in Venice was already known as the Ghetto Nuovo. Ghetto itself is thought to derive from the verb gettare, meaning to throw or to cast, which would evoke the copper foundries that had once occupied the site. So the application of the word ghetto to the Jewish quarter developed out of osmosis and not as a result of a deliberative process. Venice may hold the copyright to the term ghetto, as one scholar has aptly put it, but it is important to keep the extent of its innovation in check. The Venetians did not set out in 1516 to institute a new modus operandi for the treatment of Jews in Christian Europe. Their invention was a largely tactical, temporizing response to an unforeseen development, a pragmatic balancing of economic and religious interests governed by local short-term thinking. And so this is a bird's eye view map of Venice by Jacopo de Barbari from around 1501. So some 15 years before the ghetto was created. And if you can see this is a close-up from the Barbari map of what the Ghetto Nuovo looked like in 1501. So you can already see, those of you who have some familiarity with the ghetto, perhaps have visited the ghetto, you can already see the courtyard that makes up the Ghetto Nuovo. You can see here the bridge and the west part that leads into the Ghetto Nuovo. This is a map of the ghetto at its full extent. So you can see in the northern part here, the Ghetto Nuovo. This was the original area to which Jews were restricted in 1516. And you can see how it's essentially like a little island surrounded on all sides by water. In 1541, the Venetian government added to the ghetto in order to house Jewish merchants from the Ottoman Empire, they were merchants, they were not moneylenders. And they were restricted to the ghetto, what's called the Ghetto Vecchio, or the old ghetto. Now you might say, Why is the ghetto to which Jews were originally sent called the New Ghetto, and the ghetto that was later added called the Ghetto Vector, or the Old Ghetto? It has to do with the history of the original foundry complex that lay on the site. The Ghetto Vecchio was the site of the original foundry. And the Ghetto Nuovo was a kind of annex that was added to the site of this foundry that was mainly used as a kind of dumping ground for all the slag from the smelting process. And eventually in 1633, they added further to the ghetto this. If you look at the orange tinting, you can see this was called the Ghetto Nuovissimo, or the newest ghetto. So by that point, ghetto already had the significance of Jewish quarter. And so adding to the Jewish quarter, you called it the newest ghetto. This is a contemporary photograph of the main square, the Campo di Ghetto Nuovo. You can see the high rises here, that many of them dating from the early modern period, essentially tenements that were built in order to house a population that was expanding, but the area of the ghetto couldn't expand enough to contain them, so you had to build vertically. This is a view from the Ghetto Vecchio. The Ghetto Vecchio doesn't have a kind of main square. It's more of like a narrow street with a little bit of a square in the middle. But here it's more similar just to kind of like an alley. Anyway, so I was saying that the creation of the ghetto in Venice was a kind of tactical response to an unforeseen development. But the same cannot be said for Rome, which followed Venice in segregating its Jews some 4 decades later. In 1555, Pope Paul IV, in his bull Cum Nimis Absurdum, confined the Jews of Rome to an enclosure along the banks of the Tiber River, on the spot of the main traditional area of Jewish settlement. 7 years later, Pope Pius V used the Latin word ghettum to refer to this enclave in a bull of his own. The first evidence of the migration of the name ghetto to Rome, though Rome's ghetto would also always be known as the Seraglio or the Claustro degli Ebrei. Starting at this point, it became possible to live not merely in the ghetto of Venice, but a ghetto. And in the aftermath of the Vatican's decision to concentrate Jewish populations in the Papal States, both the institution of the Jewish quarter, the compulsory Jewish quarter, and the labeling of such quarters as ghettos spread throughout Italy. Already at its inaugural transfer from Venice to Rome, the concept of the ghetto had undergone a mutation. In Venice, the Jews did not have a long, continuous tradition of settlement prior to the creation of the ghetto. Ghettoization in this case was part of the creation of a community. Jews had lived in Rome, on the other hand, from before the establishment of the Roman Empire. Certainly, they had their own de facto neighborhoods, but their legal segregation in 1555 was a rupture, not a beginning in the history of this community. It's not surprising then that it was among Roman Jewry that the popular folk etymology linking the word ghetto to the Hebrew term get, or bill of divorce, originated. For Rome's Jews, the ghetto truly was a heightened estrangement from their Gentile neighbors relative to what they were accustomed to. In the 19th century, when this etymology was still broadly accepted, the idea of the ghetto as a kind of divorce was typically interpreted in a tragic light. But this does not appear to have been how contemporary Jews perceived their separation. The Jews of Verona seem to have marked the anniversary of their ghettoization each year with a celebratory service at which they recited special hymns and paraded Torah scrolls around the synagogue. Early modern Italian Jews argued with authorities over the boundaries or location of the ghetto. They sought, when possible, to expand its size, to ease its congestion, and to improve their living conditions. Yet they did not, for the most part, protest the idea of the ghetto as unjust. It's difficult to find in the expansive Jewish literature of the early modern period any expression of acute distress caused by the experience of being forced to live in separate quarters. Not everyone celebrated it, to be sure, but few appear to have mourned it. Over the past 30 to 40 years, scholars have increasingly questioned the degree to which ghettoization really did breed cultural isolation. The thrust of the newest scholarship on the ghetto has been to portray the ghetto as a paradoxical space, a space of legally imposed separation and concentration, yet also of comings and goings and cross-cultural encounters, a space that united Jews of different backgrounds, and at the same time frequently magnified their differences, a space that divided while also mediating between Jews and Christians, even as it also mediated between the medieval and the modern, a space in which unexpectedly Jewish culture and religion flourished. Far from simply representing the culmination and formalization of medieval segregation, the ghetto worked by effect, if not intent, to embed Jews within the fabric of the city by providing them with a place of their own, however limited and stigmatized, a halfway house between acceptance and expulsion, in the words of one scholar. From a quasi-prison for Jews, the ghetto has come to figure in the latest research as a place of real, yet permeable boundaries. And those who entered when the music was playing, the first piece was a work of Hebrew choral music that was composed by a 17th century Italian Jewish composer named Salomone de Rossi, who lived in the Mantuan ghetto and was really a pioneer in terms of the creation of polyphonic Hebrew choral music. So he was very much engaged with the cultural trends of the time, even though he was living in a ghetto. Just to show you some more slides in terms of the Roman ghetto, whereas the Venetian ghetto was located kind of like on the outskirts of the city, Rome's ghetto was very central. It's located right on the Tiber River, basically around a mile across the Tiber River from the Vatican. This shows you in 1777, the area that's tinted yellow here, what the extent of the ghetto was. This is a woodcut in 1752, what was called the Plaza Judea, or like the Jewish place, the Jewish square. And it was actually partly in the ghetto, partly outside of the ghetto. And if you look in the eastern corner, in eastern part of to the right section of the image, you can see a gate here. This was the gate leading from outside the ghetto into the ghetto. And finally, here's a watercolor from 1830 of the Piazza delle Cinque Scuole, or the Square of the Five Synagogues. This was a building that basically housed 5 different synagogues that used different rites based on the different ethnic Jews that lived in the ghetto. And the reason they were housed in one building was that the original decree had mandated that only one synagogue would be allowed to exist. And so this is how they basically circumvented that decree. And this is a watercolor of the ghetto from after the ghetto was already dismantled in 1870. This is a watercolor from the 1880s. And you see the general air of kind of like dilapidation that characterized the ghetto at this point. So we generally think of the ghetto as being of greatest relevance for Jewish life in the centuries before emancipation, a time that is often periodized as the age of ghettos, or ghetto times. My own view is that the ghetto came to have far more of a purchase on Jewish consciousness after emancipation, when far from receding into the past, it gained a centrality in discourse by and about Jews that paradoxically it did not have in the so-called age of ghettos that preceded it. The ghetto may have shaped the horizons and possibilities of those who passed the bulk of their lives therein, but it was not as freighted or as much of a fixation as it would later become, perhaps because it was taken for granted. With that, let me turn to the changing understanding of the ghetto in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So many of the ghettos of Italy and Central Europe were razed to the ground by French armies during the Napoleonic Wars as part of their campaign to export the French Revolution and its emancipation of the Jews to all the areas they conquered. In some cases, most notably in Rome, Napoleon's defeat and the restoration of the old regime resulted in a re-ghettoization of Jews. The plight of Roman Jewry, which had been steadily impoverished and worn down as a result of papal pressure over the centuries, was a focus of a great deal of attention on the part of both Jews and non-Jews in the middle decades of the 19th century. by which point the fact this community was still ghettoized was seen as a terrible anomaly and anachronism. Rome's ghetto was finally dismantled in 1870 after the popes were stripped of all temporal power and the project of Italian unification was completed. It was the last of the old European ghettos to fall. Most of the European ghettos were leveled as part of urban renewal projects, including in Rome, so that there are only a handful that one can visit today that even somewhat resemble what they once looked like. In Venice, though, many of the buildings, including the synagogues and the layout of the ghetto, were preserved, so that it offers the best opportunity to see the ghetto as it was. Starting in the middle decades of the 19th century, the word ghetto began to be absorbed into other languages and to take on a variety of figurative meanings. If the term had previously symbolized the spatial division between Jew and Christian, now it increasingly was pressed into service to picture the gap between tradition and modernity. Not only did it become more common to refer to previously mandatory Jewish sections by the newly imported ghetto label, so the Frankfurt Ghetto as opposed to Judengasse, or the Prague Ghetto rather than Judenstadt. The term also came to be attributed to Jewish sections that were not legally segregated, but were densely Jewish and deeply religious. A whole composite notion of ghetto Judaism took root in this period. This was composed of various images, sounds, and affects, but above all, it conjured a small world where the old ways remained ascendant and where the Jews remained socially and spiritually insular, whether as a result of official segregation. So, for example, the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire was frequently referred to in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the Russian Ghetto, or simply because they had yet to escape the invisible walls that confined them. Emancipated Jews imagined the ghetto on the one hand as the ultimate foil to their self-concept and current situation, as a warren of dark and narrow alleys and folk superstitions that contrasted with the open vistas and scientific worldview of the enlightened present. Others were more ambivalent, experiencing pangs of nostalgia for a milieu whose thick and unself-conscious Jewishness beckoned to those who felt a sense of aloneness and anonymity in their new situation as modern Jews. What is clear is that as a result of the semantic transformations of the 19th century, ghetto became a word that evoked not only an enclosed space, but a whole culture, an ethos, and a mentality. The immigrant ghetto, with which the word ghetto migrated from Europe to America, that emerged in the last quarter of the 19th century as a result of mass Jewish immigration out of Eastern Europe, was seen as a resurrection of a social form previously thought to be near extinction. If the overall arc of the ghetto concept in the 19th century ran from place to metaphor, the immigrant ghetto reversed this by attaching the name ghetto once again to a particular place. When the term ghetto was first applied to overcrowded Jewish immigrant neighborhoods in American cities, it had an alien ring, in particular to Americans unfamiliar with the term for a European neighborhood to which Jews were confined by law, or who instinctively associated the word with Europe. It seems strange that there should be a ghetto in an American city, and especially in New York. The author of a profile of New York's Jewish section wrote in Harper's Magazine in 1878. But there certainly is on the east side of the Bowery, below Canal Street, almost as distinctive a Jewish quarter as is to be found in any of the old European cities where the Jews for centuries have been a proscribed race. Over the next decades, despite the protests of those who rejected the application of the label to neighborhoods that were legally voluntary and more mixed in reality than in the conventional wisdom, such areas came to be known as ghettos. As this new usage of the term became normative, the meaning of the ghetto concept was modified, first in fiction and memoirs and journalism, and eventually in the emerging field of urban sociology. Densely crowded Jewish enclaves like New York's East Side, which at one time was dubbed the New York Ghetto, and Chicago's West Side, came to be seen as way stations that were tasked with mediating an immigrant journey that was at once spatial, running from east to west, and temporal, running from the old to the new. The ghetto was no longer simply before modernity. It was a kind of temporary holding center located between tradition and modernity. During the period of mass immigration, there was extensive disagreement over what should be done about the immigrant ghettos. Immigration restrictionists attributed a herding instinct to Jews and condemned the ghettos as sites of filth, overcrowding, disease, penury, and social vices. Assimilated Jews anxious about rising anti-Semitism occasionally argued for breaking up the ghettos by dispersing newcomers to rural districts in the American interior. Others defended the ghettos as essentially temporary clusterings that would disappear with the steady acculturation of the immigrant Jews, or at least their descendants. Some even trained a spotlight on the virtues and eclecticism of the ghetto as it was, or on the value of Jewish concentration per se, including in ways that challenged the equation of Americanization with melting pot assimilation. In the debate over the immigrant ghetto, the appropriateness of the word itself, ghetto, often stood in the dock. In a 1908 column entitled "The Word Ghetto" that appeared in a Reformed Jewish newspaper called The American Israelite, Molly Ida Osherman, a Chicago resident, decried what she alleged was the misapplication of the term that had become normative in newspapers and everyday language. Osherman rejected the eliding of the difference between the medieval or early modern European ghetto and the American immigrant enclave. There is no valid reason why our Jewish section must be stigmatized with the word ghetto, she claimed, adding, I am led to believe that our people as a whole, it matters not what the condition of their finances or the division of the city in which they live, the state of their general culture or intellectuality, should cooperate in eliminating from the daily vocabulary that grating, unnecessary term, the ghetto. In that way, we will tend to discourage its use from the press also. In fact, an American Jew with far better political connections than Molly Osherman had already succeeded in pressuring one major newspaper to do just that. In 1904, Louis Marshall, a prominent lawyer and American Jewish leader, wrote Adolph Oakes, the editor of the New York Times, requesting that the newspaper adopt a rule banning the word ghetto. That, quote, a lot of Jewish citizens live in a certain portion of the city, Marshall explained, is not a sufficient reason for applying to them a word which in history has been identified with contumely, oppression, ridicule, and hatred. Oakes agreed to this request, noting in his reply to Marshall his, quote, instructions to prohibit the use of the word ghetto with reference to the Jewish quarters of the East Side. And the search of the archives of the New York Times reveals no reference to various permutations of the phrase New York Ghetto from 1903 to the 1920s, precisely when this label was at its most popular. And this is just a postcard from the Lower East Side showing an image of Hester Street, one of the main thoroughfares of the East Side. And just to show you how this became a kind of place name, you can see at the bottom of the postcard, it simply labels this area the Ghetto, New York City. Or here is a detail from a colored map of Manhattan from 1926. And you can see the area above Delancey Street, although the Jewish quarter extended below Delancey Street as well. But here it simply is labeled the ghetto, just like the area west of the Bowery is identified as the Italian Quarter. So you see how once again it became a kind of toponym, a place name. The Nazi ghetto turned the model of the immigrant ghetto on its head. As a revival of the legal institution of the ghetto, the Nazi ghetto inverted the direction of the immigrant ghetto entirely. It was a place whose arrow appeared to point backward, not forward in time. The only similarity between the two was that both were conceived as temporary phenomena. The way station would come to serve as the operative metaphor for the Nazi ghetto as well, but only as a stop en route to genocide. Historians of the Holocaust more recently have challenged the commonly held belief that the Nazis established ghettos specifically to facilitate the rounding up of Jews for extermination. Still, in practice, they often served as a prelude to the death camps and killing fields, and thus gave rise to an altogether different temporality in which ghettoization was a stage not of assimilation, but annihilation. What's clear is that the Nazi ghetto bore little in common with the early modern ghetto beside the name. Notably, the Nazis in some areas sought to bar the use of the word ghetto, most notably in Warsaw, where they insisted that the ghetto be officially referred to as the Jewish Living District. Other names employed elsewhere included Jewish Living Area and Jewish Settlement. The goal was to present the all-Jewish area as a kind of natural region or habitat, rather than the coercive enclosure that it was. The Nazis sought disingenuously to avoid the pejorative connotations of the word ghetto. But even before the Nazi ghettos turned deliberately genocidal, they were intended to segregate, marginalize, control, and exploit Jews, and in many cases starve Jews, well in excess of anything the founders of the early modern ghetto could have envisioned. Now, considering how crucial the word ghetto has been to the Jewish experience, the past several decades have been striking for the extent to which the term has journeyed beyond it. The word ghetto today, writes one American urban historian, just like everything else these days, has gone global. Throughout Europe, politicians invoke the specter of the ghetto to stoke fears about allegedly unassimilable immigrant and usually Muslim enclaves in cities. Rap musicians and street artists of widely different backgrounds sometimes identify more positively with the term as a badge of authenticity, and social scientists debate its application to marginalized urban spaces around the world. For all this explosion of ghetto talk, the word ghetto has arguably become central to the collective memory and identity of only one other people beyond Jews. The African American experience strikes me as the only other case in which the word ghetto has truly acquired keyword status. Once thought of primarily as a Jewish term, the word ghetto is now perceived around the world as a symbol of Blackness, first and foremost. This shift is a result of two related yet distinct developments. First, and most obviously, the transfer of the ghetto from Jewish to Black can be told as a political and socioeconomic history of migration waves, neighborhood succession, and racist laws and practices that created, abetted, and helped to maintain substantial urban segregation of African Americans, precisely at a time when American Jews were taking advantage of opportunities for mobility held out by the suburban transformation of the metropolitan areas of North American cities. The Jewish to Black transfer can also be told as a cultural history of the importing of the term ghetto into the vocabulary of the African American experience and the gradual eclipse of its Jewish associations. From the zenith of Jim Crow in the early 20th century through the post-war era. Just as it was not preordained that the word ghetto would transcend its Phoenician origins to become the standard term for enclosed Jewish quarters in early modern Italy, or that it would then break free of its Italian roots to become a more general symbol of pre-modern Jewishness in the old Jewish neighborhood, so too was not a given that a concept and metaphor synonymous with Jewishness would become synonymous with Blackness. And just as the reasons for a nature of Black ghettoization have occasioned controversy, so too has the use of the term ghetto in reference to this phenomenon. African Americans began employing the term ghetto to refer to their own residential segregation as early as the 19-teens, at a time when several American cities were passing zoning ordinances that prohibited Black people from living on blocks where the majority of residents were white. Such laws were found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1917. Black usage of ghetto became more widespread amidst the legal battle over restrictive covenants in the aftermath of World War II. A 1948 report on segregation in Washington, D.C., published the same year that the Supreme Court banned judicial enforcement of restrictive covenants in Shelley versus Kramer, contained a chapter on housing segregation entitled Ghettos in the Capital. The authors made no bones about their intent to evoke the specter of the ghettos of the Holocaust in the way they referred to the residential segregation of Blacks. Ghetto is an ugly word, one chapter opened. To a Dane, it is ugly. To any Nazi victim. To anyone who saw how Hitler placed a yellow mark on Jews so that they could be made to live apart, suffer apart, die apart. To an American, it is ugly. The new Black referent for ghetto truly came to the fore in the 1960s, as urban race riots starting in the middle of the decade vaulted segregated areas onto the front pages of newspapers and onto television screens across the nation and the globe. Digital history resources reveal how usage of the word ghetto soared in the 1960s and 1970s, as you can see in this slide here, and how phrases like Negro ghetto or increasingly Black ghetto came to eclipse Jewish ghetto. The African-American psychologist Kenneth Clark's 1965 book, Dark Ghetto, probably did more than any other individual work to connect ghetto and Black in the mainstream media. The title of the book was doubly appropriate. For Clark, the darkness of the dark ghetto was evident not only in the skin color of its inhabitants, but in the fact that he saw such areas as bleak, desperate places, devoid of faith in a better future, and awash in self-destructive behavior and social vices, even as these areas were defended by others as the home of vibrant culture and community. The transfer of the word ghetto from Jewish to Black enclaves stirred controversy. Some pointed to the lack of statutory laws restricting African Americans to prescribed areas, but that argument overlooked a whole range of state actions, from the enforcement of restrictive covenants before 1948 to support for bank redlining and the denial of home insurance for Blacks in the suburbs, to the building of public housing in already segregated districts that made Black residential concentration far more than purely a case of de facto segregation. Others, echoing the recent firestorm over calling immigration detention centers concentration camps, protested the use of a term associated with the Holocaust. In 1964, the Jewish intellectual Maurice Sirkin wrote, "The term ghetto, now often prefixed with the adjective Black, has a specific Jewish origin. It means literally a quarter to which Jews are restricted by law." She then added, "In the immediate as well as historic experience of the Jews, a ghetto is not a metaphor. It is a concrete entity with walls, stormtroopers, and no exit save the gas chamber." Some African American thinkers objected to the label for what they saw as its stigmatization of Black communities. In a 1965 interview, the author Ralph Ellison described the portrayal of Harlem as a ghetto as, quote, "one of the most damaging misuses of a concept that has ever come about in the United States." If a Black writer, he claimed, accepted the description of Harlem as a Negro ghetto, which means, to paraphrase one of our writers, piss in the halls and blood on the stairs, he'll never see the people of whom he wishes to write. Even as the word ghetto has come today to be seen first and foremost as part of the African American experience, its usage is still not without controversy. Some view ghetto, especially when used colloquially, as an adjective meaning cheap or second rate, as slanderous and racist. Others believe that the term powerfully conveys the intractable nature of Black segregation, the reality that residence in inner city neighborhoods remains involuntary for most, practically, if not legally. This leads me to my final question. Given how much the sense of the term has changed since its introduction 500 years ago, can we speak of a common history of ghettos that link 16th century Venice to the turn of the century Lower East Side, to the Warsaw Ghetto, to contemporary Harlem? One approach to this problem would be to formulate a clearly bounded concept of the ghetto and restrict any history of ghettos to places that conform to the definition adopted. The historian of the Venetian ghetto, Benjamin Ravid, for example, has argued for limiting the term ghetto to its original meaning of a legally compulsory, physically separated, and exclusive minority district. He explicitly rejects extending the label to the more general phenomenon of the Jewish quarter, and by implication to all cases involving structural or socioeconomic, but not statutory segregation. A history of ghettos, according to this definition, would include the early modern Italian ghettos and Holocaust ghettos, even allowing for the major differences between them. But it would exclude both immigrant ghettos and African-American ghettos. The sociologist Loic Vacan similarly insists on restricting the reach of the word ghetto, though he identifies 4 constituent elements of stigma, constraint, spatial confinement, and institutional parallelism to Ravid's 3. He includes the African-American ghetto in his model, yet excludes areas that are poor and run down, yet racially or ethnically heterogeneous, like the French banlieue or the Brazilian favelas. I agree with Ravid and Vacan that the differences between the myriad places past and present given the name ghetto are too profound to enable us to generate a definition that could embrace them all. Yet for all the differences between these places, they are nevertheless linked by the term ghetto, if not without controversy. They are part of the history of the word. And words change. They change by being stretched and molded to fit new, different, yet seemingly analogous circumstances. And then when new applications become normal and alter the sense of the words themselves. To quote the feminist historian Joan Scott, those who would codify the meanings of words fight a losing battle. For words, like the ideas and things they are meant to signify, have a history. It is only by sifting through, retracing, and sometimes retrieving the cluster of images and beliefs associated with the term ghetto that the history of the ghetto can be written. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that excellent presentation. I'm excited that we have about 25 minutes or so for questions. So I will just introduce myself briefly and then open up the floor. Feel free to start putting questions in the Q&A box now. My name is Noam Pianco. I'm the director of the Strum Center for Jewish Studies, and I will be moderating the Q&A. And I apologize in advance if we don't get to all of your questions, but hopefully we will. Dan, there's one question came in, sort of a clarification question, which is a demographic one. Do you have a sense of the Jewish population of the Venice Ghetto?
Yeah, we have some data and kind of estimates. In the 17th century, there was a Venetian writer named Simone Luzzatto who wrote a discourse, basically explaining why Jews were such an asset to Venice at a time where there was a lot of scandal surrounding the Jews and the possibility of their expulsion was in the air. And he actually claimed that the population of the Venice ghetto at the time was 6,000. Now, we think that's something of an exaggeration, but this would have been around the time of the peak of its population. And it certainly seems likely that it was at least in the 4,000, 4,500. So, in a relatively small area that I showed you on the map, you had thousands of people living there. So the ghetto began to decline in its population in the 18th century. And then after the ghetto was liberated, it declines even more because then, wealthier Jews can move out and it mainly remains an area for poor Jews. But at its peak, it contained a couple of thousands of Jews.
Great, thank you. I will, still waiting for more questions, but I have one that I wanted to ask. I think one of the fantastic parts of your presentation is sort of thinking about the ghetto both as a place, but also as an idea and the way that that idea is sort of deployed. And especially it seems by Jews themselves, which I think is not something that one would normally associate with a term like ghetto. It's sort of a place that Jews are forced into. And it sounds like from your description that the idea of ghetto and the term itself becomes quite popular among Jews after they've already left the ghetto to actually sort of imagine their contemporary situation in contrast. I think you used the word foil to the past. So I guess my question is, but what wasn't clear to me, it seems like Jews, Jewish communities, Jewish leaders themselves are the folks who are primarily using the terminology. I mean, would you say that that's the case, or was it a back and forth between Jews and non-Jews? There just seems to be a tremendous amount of the story that you've told. It's really about Jews being concerned about how they are perceived and also how they were perceived and how that impacts them. So how much of the story is about Jews having agency through the term ghetto in defining themselves, and how much of it were sort of non-Jews who are using that term as a way of categorizing Jews and describing a Jew's position?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I would say when I began this project, I expected to see ghetto be much more of a kind of like outsider's term. and that the ghetto was something that was imposed on the Jews, even if, they had a longer tradition of clustering together for religious and social and communal reasons. But nevertheless, legal segregation was something that was imposed on them. But what I found is that, in the 19th and 20th century, both in the kind of transformation of the term in the 19th century, and then with its migration, to these big city immigrant enclaves, Jews were quite active in shaping and reshaping the meaning of the term. And I'll just give you an example. I didn't, mention in terms of the 19th century. One of the genres in which this transformation of the term really originated was this genre that was called Ghetto Literature. That began as a mostly German language and to some extent French language genre, but then actually spread throughout Europe and eventually migrated to England, and you could say also to some extent to the United States. And it was Jewish authors who were appropriating this term. And they were also changing the meaning of it in the process, because the ghetto they had in mind wasn't, these restricted areas of Italian cities, which had been really the only major understanding of ghetto prior to emancipation. They were largely referring to, these kind of like old areas, of traditional Jewish societies that weren't necessarily legally segregated. In fact, today we refer to many of these kind of Jewish areas in Eastern Europe as shtetls. The Yiddish term shtetl, which is a very different phenomenon from the urban ghetto. It was a kind of market town, a little market town. Shtetl means in Yiddish little town, surrounded mostly by countryside, in which Jews were often a plurality and sometimes even a majority of the city. So very different from being an enclosed minority in a larger city that's mostly Gentile. And yet Western authors increasingly refer to these shtetls as ghettos. And why? Because they now associate the word ghetto with kind of like the old Jewish world. And so they impose it on these areas, even though there really wasn't legally mandated segregation in the shtetl. There were Jewish neighborhoods, as there always have been, but there wasn't legally mandated segregation. So I would say that this was always controversial. There were always, as I gave examples of, there were always Jews who pushed back against the appropriation of the label because, they seized on some of its negative connotations and felt that it was defamatory. And, it is the case that, I talked about some of the immigration restrictionists who would refer to ghetto Jews. And they're clearly doing so in a disparaging way. And so you see why, some of the more assimilated Jewish elite in the United States at the time might have tried to say, we don't want to hear this word ghetto because it has all these negative connotations. But I've found that this word ghetto was far more of an intra-Jewish discourse than it was something that was imposed on Jews.
Great. We have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to put two of them together that deal with some of the contemporary implications of the term. The first is as follows. Where I grew up, the word ghetto can also describe acts of resourcefulness and creativity when resources are limited. Non-Black people call similar acts as life hacks. Do you have any thoughts about that? That's one question. Another, I think, question is, hold on, this keeps, in Jewish activist circles in the United States today, claims of allyship with immigrants are often made on the grounds that Jews were once immigrants or that Jews were also once enslaved, or as you mentioned, the concentration camp analogy. Why do you think the term ghetto has not been activated in similar ways? More broadly, what does the history of the term ghetto tell us about white Jewish and Black dynamics?
Okay, so in terms of the first question, I actually have to say, I did not know of this, particular meaning that the word ghetto had. I can say that, it's interesting, ghetto has a variety of meanings colloquially today. If you can find slang dictionaries, and one definition for ghetto will be something like cheap, second-rate, inferior. And yet another definition will be kind of like cutting edge, super cool, kind of like the ghetto fabulous idea, although that also has some negative connotations. So, both of these ideas can, coexist. And so, it's interesting to hear of another connotation that the ghetto has that I didn't know of, this idea of resourcefulness.
Yeah.
In terms of the second question, it's a really great question. But I have to say that, in the post-war period, ghetto did not play an entirely dissimilar role. In other words, Jews often did say, in terms of trying to forge common ground with Blacks, they would say things like, we also were once slaves. We also lived in ghettos. Ghettos are also part of our historical experience. And in that way, trying to mobilize Jews for civil rights activity as a way of forming a kind of historical sympathy. There was even, I remember an advertisement that the American Jewish Congress took out in the New York Times in 1969 that basically said that, we have both been slaves. We have both lived in ghettos. So the term was used like that, and it became also a bone of contention because, there were Jews who, as I described, basically pushed back against it forming any analogy, basically saying ghetto was a Jewish term, especially because of all the Holocaust resonances, like the same resistance to a Holocaust analogy that we saw in this concentration camp case. You also found with the word ghetto in the 1960s, and not just the 1960s. I discussed an incident in my book in the 1990s at the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, where on the eve of that, a Jewish author wrote something to the extent in an op-ed in the Washington Post that basically said, ghetto is a Jewish term. I don't see any barbed wire or guard towers around 125th Street in Harlem. Now, for the most, there actually weren't guard towers for the most part in ghettos. Like you see the way in which images conflate between concentration camps and ghettos, but you see it kind of holding on to it. And the same thing is true of, often African Americans resisted this attempt of Jews to try to forge commonality, on the word ghetto in terms of these historical experiences by saying, but you have now become essentially white. You've kind of whitened yourselves. Even if you're not really white, you've basically succumbed to white America. You've assimilated out of Jewishness, out of something that could maybe link you with Blackness. And so you no longer have claim to these terms, and your attempt to arrogate them to yourselves is obnoxious and rejected. So, I see the term as playing that kind of complex role in terms of, it can serve as a source of solidarity, this idea we have both lived in ghettos, but also as something driving Jews and Blacks apart, this idea that now that you're out of the ghetto, you have no compunction about leaving us in.
Thank you. A question about the perception of the ghetto as a dangerous or criminal area. Is that a 20th century phenomenon reflective of anti-Black racism? Or do you see suspicions on the part of Christians that being in the Jewish quarter after dark was highly likely to indicate criminal activity?
That's a great question. There were certainly associations with Jews with the kind of criminality. Not necessarily, this was mainly an association. There was sometimes an association of Jews with more like financial crime and economic crime in the ghettos, like things like fraud or theft. There is sometimes an association of Jews in early modern Europe with criminality, with kind of vagrancy and banditry. But that's not so much focused necessarily on ghettos per se. And the Lower East Side was seen as a slum. It was seen as a somewhat an area that did have gang crime and some mob crime. But I do think that the violent association is much more prevalent in the case of the Black ghetto, and does speak to this conflation of Blackness with violence that is part of the story of racism in this country, and including 20th century and even 21st century racism.
Great. There are two questions, I think, trying to get at the sense and the perception that Jews in the Italian ghetto had of their own situation. So one asks, it sounds like the original ghetto of Venice was not necessarily viewed by Jews as a negative place or concept. Is this true? Was it more crowded and unpleasant than other areas of Venice? And I think an associated question is, you referenced the fact that toward the end, towards the time of the inception of the ghetto in Italy, many Jews were more upset with the conditions of the ghetto rather than the concept of the ghetto itself. In the 1500s, did Jews typically appreciate ghettos as cementing their place in cities such as Venice, despite their conditions, or was their outrage over the ghetto's conditions more prevalent? Were the majority of Jews in the 16th century upset, happy to be living in these segregated areas?
It's a great question. It's also just a hard question to answer. The evidence is mixed. In some communities, Jews, protested the creation of the ghetto. They tried to delay it. They used bribes to try to, buy, Italian, local city official, municipal officials off. There were various reasons. I mean, first of all, even if the idea of living as a cluster Jewish community is not necessarily a negative, but the idea that you're going to live in a community that won't necessarily be large enough to house the population so that there will be, a kind of deprivation is something that people would protest. In some cases, there were also the issues that where ghettos would be created. So Jews might be more open to a ghetto being created on the area where Jews currently lived in the city, as opposed to being relegated to some outlying area, which might be a slum or less well defended by the city government. So they had various objections in some cases, although not always. But what I was trying to say is, the way in which the idea of a ghetto today strikes, us as unjust, like as a basic form of inequality, of a mistreatment of people. Jews did not protest the idea of the ghetto as such. And also I found it, the Jews just didn't discuss the ghetto that much in early modern writing. If you look at, one of a great text, the autobiography of a rabbi and polymath who lived in the Venetian ghetto in the 17th century, Leon de Modena, a fascinating Jew. And it's a fascinating autobiography all about, his experiences and his foibles and the fact that he has this gambling addiction and all the teaching that he does and the books that he's writing on all sorts of subjects. He discussed the ghetto as a source of deprivation, and really only elusively, not directly. He refers to one of the places he lived in the ghetto as he calls it the cave of Machpelah. The cave of Machpelah is the underground cave in the city of Hebron that both Jews and Muslims hold sacred. Jews believe that it's the burial place, of the patriarchs and matriarchs, but it's very underground. So he was basically referring to the idea that he felt kind of, in this cramped underground, situation. But for the most part, you don't see Jews expressing a lament about being forced to live in ghettos, and sometimes they actually expressed appreciation for it. Whether because they saw it perhaps as having saved the community from a worse fate of expulsion, or perhaps because it helped, cement the solidarity of the community, or because perhaps it made the observation of certain aspects of Jewish ritual law easier. Sometimes you find appreciations of the ghettos. So, yeah, that was one of the surprises that I encountered in researching this book, that the ghetto had a different valence in the early modern period than it has today.
Thanks, Dan. We have two questions about sort of the geographic scope of this term. You spoke about Europe and the United States. What about other continents, Asia, Africa, especially where there were Jewish communities that moved into those parts of the world? Did you see any references to ghetto appear in those parts of, around the globe?
Yeah, so certainly with immigrant enclaves, that would be formed through this mass immigration of Jews out of Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century. Many of the areas to which Jews migrate, like South Africa, for example, the term, it gets used there. You know, I didn't mention there are also other forms of residential segregation of Jews, you know, in the Arab Muslim world. If you think of Morocco, for example, you know, it had this space, this Jewish space that is established in many Moroccan cities, roughly contemporaneous with the Italian ghettos, but it was called a melach. Not a, you know, the word ghetto was an Italian word. They called it a melach. And there are some similarities between the melach and the ghetto, but there are also some crucial differences. You know, the Italian ghetto was an exclusively Jewish space, not necessarily in the sense that, yes, there were comings and goings. Christians came into the ghetto to do business by day. They came to listen to rabbinic sermons. They, you know, Leon de Modena talks about how he has all these Christians, nobles, visitors who come to listen to his sermons. And Jews left the ghetto to do business in the city or to visit Gentile acquaintances. So it was not exclusively Jewish, but residentially at least. Only Jews were allowed to live. Jews had to live there, and only Jews were allowed to live there. The segregation was somewhat less neat in the case of the Moroccan melach, in that Jews lived there, but not necessarily all Jews lived there. And there were other, you know, sometimes foreign visitors would be housed in the melach. There were Christians who lived in the melach, sometimes Christian churches that were in the melach. So there wasn't the same type of strict residential segregation. It was a little bit more porous than the Italian case. Now, sometimes you do see, like in the 19th and 20th century, I talked about how some of the shtetls, you know, come to be, when they try to westernize them, they refer to them as ghettos in a misleading way. So you also see in, you know, 20th century literature about the Jewish North African experience. I'm thinking about, you know, the late Tunisian Jewish French author Albert Memmi's, his novel from the early 1950s, Pillar of Salt, which, you know, starts about the Tunisian, what it was called in Tunis was the Hara, that was the Jewish quarter. But he refers to it as the ghetto. He's writing in French. He's trying to mediate this to a European readership. And so the word ghetto by then is much more familiar to them than the term Clara. So you do see a similar process in which the term ghetto, at least in, you know, more Western writing, comes to eclipse more native terms. But yeah, I mean, you know, there were similar phenomena in the Arab and Muslim world, but there were differences as well that were crucial differences. That's how I'd answer that.
Great, thanks, Dan. We have time for one last question, and it relates to your first book. As your first book dealt with Spinoza, did he have anything to say about the ghetto as a concept or term? And if he didn't comment on it, what do you think he would have said about it?
That's an interesting question. The answer is he did not comment explicitly on the ghetto. I should mention that Amsterdam, you know, 17th century Amsterdam did not have a ghetto. It had a Jewish quarter. You know, it had an area of the city where most Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews lived. But it was not a mandatory ghetto. There were no curfews. There were no walls. There were no gates. And I think the Spinoza would have objected to the ghetto for a variety of reasons. First of all, I mean, he objected to the whole idea of a kind of autonomous Jewish community. Anything that resembled a state within a state. He basically saw, you know, Judaism as having no kind of raison d'etre in the post-biblical, post-exilic period. Basically, Judaism had validity only so long as a Jewish state existed. Once it ceased to exist, you know, it had become bunk as far as he was concerned, and it had no more meaning. So the very fact that you would have a kind of isolated pocket of Jewishness within the city that was living to some extent according to their own laws basically conflicted with his republicanism and also with his antagonism toward Jews. So that's how I'd answer that question.
Right. Thank you. Thank you all for all of your questions. I want to thank you all for coming today, to Ben Lee for the introduction, and of course to Professor Daniel Schwartz for joining us and for sticking with us. after over the last 2 years to make this lecture actually happen. A reminder to join us for a Sephardic Studies webinar on May 5th, The Jews of Ottoman Izmir, with Dina Danon in conversation with our colleague Devin Nar. And also please save the date for the 2021 Strum Lectures with Julia Watts-Belzer, which will take place on May 25th and 27th, also online. Thanks again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Bye.